Welcome to our deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at the fascinating world of geopolitics.
Oh, cool.
Have you ever read a book that, completely changes how you see things?
Yeah,
That's
definitely.
kind of what we're hoping to do today with
Oh,
this book
fun.
called Prisoners of Geography by Tim Marshall.
Hmm.
This book argues that the mountains and the rivers and the coastlines, even climates we often take for granted,
Right.
they have a huge impact on global politics and conflicts, even in the 21st century.
Yeah, it's crazy how often we kind of just overlook that stuff,
Totally.
you know?
And after reading this book, you start to see things through a whole new lens. You
Absolutely.
start connecting the dots between the physical world and the actions of nations.
So it's a really interesting perspective.
Let's just jump right in.
Yeah.
A country that's been in the headlines a lot lately, Russia.
Okay, yeah.
Marshall kicks things off by talking about Russia's sheer size.
Right.
I mean, it's twice the size of the
Yeah.
USA or China.
That's mad.
But it's not just about how big it is, it's about the shape of that vastness.
Yeah, that's really key.
Right.
You see, Russia has this historically persistent problem, a lack of easily defensible borders,
Okay.
particularly in the West. And this has really shaped their strategic thinking for centuries.
So help me understand this.
Mm.
What makes those western borders so vulnerable?
Well, just imagine a giant plain
Okay.
stretching all the way from the Russian border to France.
Wow.
That's the North European plain, and it's been a super highway for invaders throughout history.
It's like a wide open door.
Exactly. Think about it. The Poles, the Swedes, Napoleon's French army, the Germans twice in the World Wars.
Oh my God.
They've all marched across that flat expanse right into the heart of Russia.
Wow, that's a lot of historical baggage.
It is.
It's no wonder Russia's a little sensitive about its western flank.
You could say that.
But how does that explain what's happening in Ukraine today?
Well, Marshall makes a really interesting point. He says that Russia sees Ukraine as a crucial buffer zone. He even quotes this kind of chilling line from the book.
Okay.
When faced with what is considered an existential threat, a great power will use force.
Wow.
And losing influence in Ukraine was, in their eyes, that kind of threat.
So taking Crimea wasn't just about Putin wanting a warm water port.
No, no.
There was more to it.
Oh, much more. Crimea is a strategic piece in Russia's security puzzle.
I see.
It gives them a dominant position in the Black Sea, which they see as vital.
But even with Crimea, Russia's access to global sea lanes is still pretty limited, right?
Precisely. That lack of a truly reliable warm water port is a constant source of strategic anxiety for them. It pushes them westward, even if their options are limited.
I see.
And then there's the whole energy issue.
The pipeline politics everyone's talking about.
Exactly.
Tell me more about that.
Well, Russia has these vast reserves of oil and gas,
Right.
and they use that leverage expertly. They offer favorable energy deals to friendly nations
Okay.
and can make things very difficult for those who oppose them. You've got the Nord Stream pipeline going straight to Germany,
Mm-hmm.
the Yamal pipeline supplying Poland and Germany, and then there's South Stream intended for Southern and Central Europe.
So it's like each pipeline is a chess move,
Yeah.
carefully calculated to exert influence.
Exactly. Control over these energy pipelines gives Russia considerable power.
Wow.
And it's something Western leaders are very aware of, especially in light of, recent events.
For sure.
Now, in stark contrast to Russia's westward anxieties, let's turn our attention eastward to China.
Okay, I'm ready for a change of scenery. Everyone knows China is like a rising power, but how does geography play into that?
Well, China's geography is almost the opposite of Russia's.
Okay.
Think of it as a fortress protected by natural barriers.
Interesting.
The Gobi Desert to the north, the Himalayas to the west, and jungles to the south.
Right.
These have historically given China a sense of security that Russia has always lacked.
So China is almost as big as Russia, but its size is contained within these natural walls.
That's a good way to put it.
But it's not like they haven't expanded at all, right? I mean, they've been making moves in places like Tibet.
You're absolutely right. They have this history of outward expansion,
Mm-hmm.
but it's been more calculated, less driven by that same desperate need for buffer zones that you see in Russia.
Yeah.
Take Tibet, for instance.
Okay.
China sees the Tibetan Plateau as both a buffer zone and a source of strategic resources.
Okay.
They've been investing heavily in infrastructure there, roads, railways, even airports.
But hasn't that led to some tension with the local Tibetan population?
Well, it certainly has. The influx of Han Chinese settlers drawn by these development projects
Right.
has changed the demographics of the region, leading to resentment and sometimes even violence.
Yeah.
And this pattern isn't limited to Tibet. You see similar tensions in other areas along China's periphery, like Manchuria and Xinjiang,
Right.
where Han Chinese now outnumber the native populations.
So even with this fortress geography, China is still expanding, but it's more of like an inward pressure,
Yeah.
pushing into these historically distinct regions within its borders.
That's a good way to think about it.
But I also read that China is expanding its influence in the South China Sea, right? What's the story there?
That brings us to China's maritime ambitions. They're building up their navy, flexing their muscles in the South China Sea
Mm-hmm.
to secure valuable resources and control those critical shipping lanes.
Right.
It's a different kind of expansion using economic and strategic leverage rather than brute military force.
I see.
They even built pipelines through Burma to reduce their reliance on the Strait of Malacca, a key choke point they see as a vulnerability.
So we've got Russia pushing West China, consolidating its power and looking outward strategically.
Mm-hmm.
Where does that leave the United States in this geographical power play?
That's where we see a completely different set of geographical advantages at play. The U.S. has a unique position, what Marshall calls from sea to shining sea.
I love that phrase. It really captures the sense of like vastness and opportunity.
Doesn't it?
That shaped the American experience. Abundant resources, navigable rivers, oceans on both sides.
Yeah,
It really is like they hit the geographical jackpot.
absolutely. All of that contributed to their incredibly rapid rise to power.
And think about it. The Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the country overnight.
Right.
And then they took a huge chunk of land from Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
It all happened so quickly. It really is fascinating to see how geography helped shape those events.
It's true. John Quincy Adams, who was Secretary of State at the time of the Louisiana Purchase,
Okay.
he wrote that securing a definite boundary to the Pacific Ocean was a great epoch in our history. He knew even then that geography was shaping destiny.
So they secured this massive resource-rich territory protected by two oceans. But then what happened? They didn't just sit there and enjoy their good fortune, did they? Well, they kind of inherited the world after World War II.
Right.
They became the dominant global superpower,
Right.
which comes with its own set of geographic challenges.
For sure.
Suddenly, they needed to project their power across oceans, and that led to all sorts of interesting development.
Exactly. You can see that shift in things like the destroyers for bases deal with Britain during the war.
Okay.
The U.S. traded old warships for access to British bases around the world.
Wow.
And then after the war, they built this incredible network of military bases that basically encircle the globe.
So their geographic security at home actually pushed them to expand their reach globally.
Yeah.
That's quite a twist. But hasn't that global reach also led to some, miscalculations?
It has. That's one of the interesting consequences of America's geographical good fortune.
Mm-hmm.
It fostered a sense of exceptionalism.
Oh.
This idea that they were somehow destined for greatness, protected by divine providence.
Right, right. I see where you're going with this.
Yeah.
That kind of thinking could lead to a certain blindness,
Yeah,
right?
it could.
A belief that they could reshape the world without fully grasping the complexities on the ground.
Exactly. You see that in places like Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah.
The U.S. went in with this idea that they could impose democracy and build stable nations.
Right.
But they underestimated the power of history, of long-standing tribal and sectarian divisions.
Yeah.
You can't just force democracy on people who aren't ready for it or don't want it.
It's that they forgot that geography isn't just about physical landscapes.
Right.
It's also about the people who live in those landscapes
Yeah.
and the history they carry with them.
Absolutely.
Those factors can be just as powerful as any mountain range.
Couldn't agree more. Those historical and cultural layers add a whole other dimension to the geopolitical map.
For sure. And speaking of layers, let's hop across the Atlantic and take a look at Europe,
Okay.
a continent where geography has created both division and, more recently, a push towards unity.
Interesting.
Everyone knows Europe has had a pretty tumultuous history, to say the least.
You could say that.
But how does geography play into that? I mean, it's not exactly a fortress like China
Right.
or a wide open expanse like Russia or the U.S.
You've hit on a key point. Europe's geography is fragmented,
Okay.
with mountains, rivers, peninsulas,
Yeah.
like a giant puzzle. And that fragmented geography led to the development of distinct nations and cultures.
I see.
unlike the USA, which expanded across a vast open space.
So instead of one big melting pot, you had all these smaller entities
Yeah,
constantly competing for resources and territory.
exactly.
That makes sense.
And it's reflected in Europe's long history of warfare.
Right.
Marshall talks about the German question,
Okay.
which essentially asks, how do you deal with a powerful nation like Germany,
Right.
stuck in the middle of this geographically fragmented continent?
Yes. The German question. Their neighbors were understandably nervous about a powerful Germany,
Right.
especially after World War II. So how did they deal with that?
Well, after two devastating world wars, Europe embarked on a remarkable experiment, the European Union.
Okay.
The idea was to overcome those historical divisions through economic and political integration.
So they were trying to defy geography in a way
Yeah.
by creating a new kind of entity based on shared interests and a commitment to peace. That's a bold idea, but did it really work?
To a large extent, yes, Europe enjoyed decades of peace and prosperity.
Mm-hmm.
However, even within the EU, you see the enduring influence of geography.
Yeah.
Look at the North-South economic divide, for example.
Yeah.
With the richer, more industrialized nations of the North versus the struggling economies of the South.
Right.
Marshall calls these cracks in the House of Europe.
Interesting.
And those cracks became very visible during the 2008 financial crisis.
Right. The North had to bail out the South.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of resentment on both sides.
There was.
So does this mean the EU experiment is doomed? Is geography going to pull it apart in the end?
That's a question Marshall leaves us to ponder.
Okay.
He suggests that the German question could reemerge if the EU falters. Certainly something to think about.
Wow. A lot to consider there. So we've seen how geography has shaped the destinies of some of the world's major powers.
Mm-hmm.
But what about those regions that haven't had it quite so easy? What about a continent that's been shaped by both its physical landscape and the legacy of colonialism like Africa?
Africa is a fascinating case study. It's a vast continent, 3 times the size of the USA,
Wow.
and incredibly diverse. But it's also a continent riddled with geographic challenges.
Okay.
Think about it. Poor natural harbors, unnavigable rivers, vast deserts, dense rainforests.
Right.
All of those factors have historically isolated Africa from the kind of exchange of ideas and technologies that flowed more easily across the Eurasian landmass.
And then, of course, you have the added burden of colonialism,
Right.
which further complicated things.
Absolutely. The colonial powers came in, drew these arbitrary borders that ignored existing tribal and ethnic realities,
Yeah.
and created these artificial nation states that often lacked any kind of internal cohesion.
Wow.
It's like they set the stage for decades of conflict.
And the legacy of those colonial borders is still felt today, right?
It is.
I mean, look at the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC.
Yeah.
It's a huge country with vast resources, but it's been ravaged by conflict.
The DRC is a tragic example of how poorly drawn borders can have lasting consequences.
It's heartbreaking.
It is.
And it seems like that's a recurring theme in many parts of Africa.
Yeah.
These countries are rich in resources,
Right.
but those resources often become a source of conflict rather than prosperity.
You're right. And it highlights the complex interplay between geography, history, and politics.
Mm-hmm.
It's never just one factor in isolation.
Yeah.
Which brings us to another region where those factors are deeply intertwined, the Middle East.
Okay, the Middle East. Talk about a region where geography and history collide.
Right.
It's the crossroads of so much religions, empires, trade routes. Where do we even begin to unpack all of that?
I think it's crucial to understand the legacy of colonialism here.
Okay.
Remember that infamous line drawn on a map by British and French diplomats back in 1916?
Yeah, vaguely.
The Sykes-Picot Agreement, as it's known,
Okay.
essentially carved up the Ottoman Empire and created the borders of modern-day Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon.
Wait, are you saying that one line drawn over 100 years ago is still shaping the region today?
Yeah.
That's incredible.
It's a powerful illustration of how seemingly arbitrary decisions made in the past
Yeah.
can have a profound and lasting impact.
Wow.
Those borders were drawn with little regard for the existing tribal and religious communities,
Right.
which created the conditions for much of the conflict we see today.
And then, of course, you have the Sunni-Shia divide,
Right.
a centuries-old rift within Islam that continues to fuel tensions and violence.
Exactly. Marshall uses Iraq as a case study,
Okay.
pointing out that the country was essentially cobbled together from 3 distinct regions: Assyria, Babylonia, and Sumer.
3 ancient civilizations crammed into one modern nation-state.
Exactly.
It's no wonder they've struggled to find a unified identity.
Right. And then there are the Kurds, geographically concentrated in northern Iraq,
Okay.
who have carved out a semi-autonomous region.
Which shows how geography can be a source of both division and empowerment, right?
Yes.
It can create barriers,
Yeah.
but it can also create opportunities.
Absolutely. It's a constant push and pull. And speaking of push and pull, let's shift our focus to two nations that have been locked in a geographic rivalry since their very creation, India and Pakistan.
Now, this is one I'm particularly curious about. The India-Pakistan conflict is well known, but I never really thought about the geography of it. How does that play into their relationship?
It all goes back to the partition of British India in 1947.
Okay.
The Himalayas and the Indus River Valley formed a natural border,
Right.
but it was a border drawn hastily and with little regard for the complex religious and cultural realities on the ground.
I see.
Millions of people were displaced.
Wow.
And it instantly created two nations locked in a geographic rivalry, especially over the disputed region of Kashmir.
Kashmir seems to be the focal point of their conflict. But it's more than just a territorial dispute, right?
It is.
There's a deeper layer of geographic anxiety at play, isn't there?
You're right. Pakistan in particular is in a tough spot geographically.
Okay.
They lack strategic depth.
You mean because India is so much larger and could potentially just roll right over them?
Essentially, yes. The distance from the Indian border to Pakistan's capital, Islamabad, is less than 250 miles.
Wow.
And it's mostly flat ground. That lack of room to maneuver is a major source of anxiety for Pakistani leaders.
So it makes sense that they've been so heavily involved in Afghanistan.
It does.
They see it as a potential buffer zone against India.
Precisely. They want a friendly government in Kabul that can provide them with some strategic depth if things escalate with India. It all comes back to geography, securing your flanks and anticipating potential threats.
Wow. It really is like a giant game of Risk being played out on a global scale,
It is.
with Pakistan stuck with some pretty bad dice rolls.
But while Pakistan might be facing some tough geographic realities,
Right.
it's not the only region grappling with these challenges. Let's shift gears and talk about Latin America,
Okay.
a continent that's incredibly rich in resources, but faces its own set of geographic obstacles.
Latin America has always seemed kind of disconnected to me, geographically speaking.
Interesting.
Like it's just kind of there south of the U.S.,
Right.
but I know there's a lot more to it than that.
Yeah.
What are some of the key geographic factors that have shaped the region?
That sense of disconnectedness, you feel, is partly due to its geography.
Okay.
The region is dominated by mountains, rainforests, and deserts.
Okay.
This makes internal transportation and trade difficult, which has hindered economic development.
So it's similar to Africa in that way, right?
It is.
Vast distances and challenging landscapes make it hard to connect people and resources.
You see those parallels, absolutely.
Yeah.
And then there's what they call the tyranny of distance. Latin America is far from the major global markets of North America and Europe,
Yeah.
which limits economic growth.
It's almost like they're just too far away from where the action is.
Right. And that geographic isolation has led to some interesting social and political dynamics.
Okay.
You see this phenomenon of mega cities, where a huge chunk of the population is concentrated in a few urban centers, often surrounded by sprawling slums.
Right.
This leads to stark inequalities and social tensions.
Yeah.
In some countries like Peru and Argentina, over 30% of the population lives in the capital city's metropolitan area.
That's mind-boggling. It's amazing to see how these seemingly simple geographical factors can have such a profound impact on societies.
They can.
So we've covered pretty much every continent except Antarctica.
Right.
And speaking of frozen wastelands, what about the Arctic?
Okay.
How does that fit into this global picture?
The Arctic is where things get really interesting and potentially quite scary.
Okay.
Climate change is rapidly transforming the region,
Right.
melting the ice and opening up new shipping routes, access to natural resources,
Wow.
and unfortunately, the potential for conflict.
Wait, so the Arctic is becoming like a new frontier. That's wild. I had no idea it was changing so rapidly.
It is, and it's attracting a lot of attention. It's a frontier with valuable resources up for grabs. You probably heard about the recent discovery of one of the ships
Oh, yes.
from Sir John Franklin's ill-fated 1845 Arctic expedition.
The HUS Erebus. They found it using sonar.
Right.
It was a fascinating discovery, but also a bit eerie,
Yeah.
considering all those men died up there in the ice.
It's a stark reminder of how unforgiving the Arctic can be, but as the ice melts, that landscape is becoming more accessible.
Right.
And that's attracting attention from all over the world.
So it's like a new gold rush,
Yeah.
but with potentially higher stakes.
Who are the main players in this new great game, as I've heard it called?
Well, all the Arctic nations, Canada, Russia, the U.S., Norway, Denmark,
Okay.
they're all staking their claims. And it's not just about the resources. Melting ice is opening up new shipping routes that could dramatically shorten travel times between Asia and Europe.
So the Arctic is becoming a new global highway. That's a game changer. It certainly is. And it's got everyone scrambling to secure their interests. Remember when Russia planted a flag on the seabed of the North Pole a few years back?
Oh, yeah. That was a pretty bold move.
Ugh.
It definitely sent a message.
It did. It showed how seriously they're taking the Arctic.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not alone. All the Arctic nations are beefing up their military presence in the region. It's definitely a potential flashpoint for conflict
Yeah.
as the ice continues to melt and the stakes get even higher.
This is where I need you to connect the dots for me.
No.
What are the implications of a melting Arctic for the rest of the world? I mean, for those of us who live thousands of miles away.
Think about the albedo effect.
Okay.
Melting ice and exposed land absorb more heat,
Right.
which accelerates the warming process.
Okay.
The Arctic acts like a giant reflector, and as that reflector disappears, the whole planet feels the heat.
I see.
We're talking rising sea levels, more extreme weather events,
Right.
and potentially devastating consequences for coastal communities all over the world. What happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic.
Okay. I'm officially concerned now.
I understand. It's a sobering thought. But it's important to remember that we're not just passive observers in all of this.
Right.
Our choices, our actions, have a direct impact on the future of the planet. And understanding the power of geography is crucial to making those choices wisely.
So we've gone from Russian tanks on the North European plain to melting ice caps in the Arctic.
We have.
Feels like the stakes have never been higher.
Hmm.
What happens next? How does understanding geography help us navigate the challenges we face today? We've gone from Russian tanks on the North European plain to melting ice caps in the Arctic.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
It feels like the stakes have never been higher.
Yeah.
What happens next? How does understanding geography help us navigate the challenges we face today?
Well, one thing that really struck me while we were exploring Prisoners of Geography is that we're living in a time of, unprecedented change.
Okay.
Climate change is reshaping the Arctic technology, is blurring borders.
Right.
And the balance of global power is shifting in unpredictable ways.
So the old maps, the old assumptions, they don't really hold up anymore.
Exactly. We need a new way of looking at the world.
Yeah.
One that takes into account these rapidly evolving geographic realities.
Right. And that's why I think our deep dive today has been so valuable.
It has.
It's given us a new framework for understanding
It has.
the complex forces at play.
For sure.
I completely agree. Honestly, I knew geography mattered, but I never truly grasped the full scope of its impact until now.
Yeah.
So as we wrap things up, what's one key takeaway you hope our listeners will remember?
I think the most important takeaway is this. Geography is not destiny,
Right.
but it's a powerful force that shapes the course of history.
Right.
Understanding that force is essential to making sense of the world around us and to making informed decisions about the future.
Absolutely. It's like this hidden code that explains so much about why things happen the way they do.
It is.
It's a bit humbling, actually, to realize how much we're all influenced by these forces we often don't even consider.
For sure. It's a reminder that we're all connected in ways we might not always realize. What happens in one part of the world inevitably ripples out and affects us all.
Right.
Think about the melting Arctic, for example. It's not just a problem for the Arctic nations. It's a global problem with global consequences.
That's a powerful point.
Yeah.
So as we navigate this increasingly complex world,
Yeah.
what's one question you would encourage our listeners to keep asking?
Here's a question to ponder. As climate change continues to reshape the global landscape, how will geography redraw the map of power and conflict in the 21st century?
That's a big one. Will we see new alliances forming,
Potentially.
new conflicts erupting over scarce resources?
It's hard to predict with certainty,
Right.
but those are definitely possibilities. I think about the potential for conflict over water scarcity in the Middle East, or competition for arable land in Africa. And as these resources become more scarce, migration patterns will shift, leading to new social and political challenges.
So it's not just about geopolitics then.
It's not.
It's about human survival, about adapting to a changing world that puts things in a whole new perspective.
It does. And it underscores the importance of understanding geography,
Hmm.
not just as a subject in school,
Right.
but as a lens through which we can better understand the world around us and our place in it.
Well said. Well, on that note, we're going to wrap up our deep dive into Prisoners of Geography.
Okay.
We hope you've enjoyed exploring the world through this new lens,
I did.
and that you'll continue to think about how geography shapes the events unfolding around us.
Remember, the next time you see a news story about an international crisis
Hmm.
or a political debate, take a moment to consider the geographic factors at play.
Okay.
Look at a map, think about the mountains, the rivers, the coastlines,
Yeah.
and ask yourself, how is geography influencing the situation? You might be surprised by what you discover.
That's great advice. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration of the forces that shape our world.